Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 179th New Social Environment. I am Nick Bennett and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between artist Sanford Biggers and the Rail's very own Yasi Alipour. We'll also be joined by poet Isabel Sobral Campos, who will read a few verses to close today's program. We would like to thank our friends at Marianne Boesky Gallery for making this talk possible today. Sanford's current exhibition, Soft Truths, is on view at the gallery through December 12th, for which we'll share some more info through links in the chat. To begin, I ask you all to join me in acknowledging the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation, the traditional owners of Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters on which we stand. The Brooklyn Rail also recognizes the illegal annexation of the Republic of Artsakh as a grave international injustice. We stand in support of the Armenian people and the global Armenian diaspora. Finally, the Brooklyn Rail stands in solidarity with the uprisings in response to the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAdie, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy-Fells, Toyin Salau, Walter Wallace Jr., and countless others we have lost to white supremacy and police violence in this country, and acknowledge that justice will come from the streets, from the nation demanding accountability, and refusing to move on until Black Lives Matter in the eyes of the state. Before I introduce our guest and host today, please join us for a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now to introduce our guest. Sanford Biggers was raised in Los Angeles and currently lives and works in New York City. His work is an interplay of narrative, perspective, and history that speaks to current social, political, and economic happenings, while also examining the contexts that bore them. His diverse His diverse practice positions him as a collaborator with the past through explorations of often overlooked cultural and political narratives from American history. Working with antique quilts that echo rumors of their use as signposts on the Underground Railroad, he engages these legends and contributes to this narrative by drawing and painting directly onto them. As creative director and keyboardist, he fronts Moon Medicin, a multimedia concept band that straddles visual art and music with performances staged against a backdrop of curated sound effects and videos. We are joined by host Yasi Alipour, who is an Iranian artist, writer, thinker, and folder who currently lives in Brooklyn and wanders about paper, politics, and performance. She teaches at Columbia University, where she got her MFA and SVA, and is currently a resident at the Sharp Walenta Studio program, where she is tuning in from today. Yasi is a dearly beloved contributor of the Rail. And now, without further ado, Yasi, I pass the mic over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's great to be back, seeing so many familiar faces, from Columbia teachers to my Rail family to my students. And I thought a lot about what it means to introduce Sanford. There's currently 2 of his exhibitions in New York, and I think it's an amazing, rare moment to actually engage with his practice. Code Switch is at the Bronx Museum and will be open till late January. And Soft Truths is at Marianne Boesky, and that's till, I think Nick mentioned it, December. But I also wanted to add, and then Sanford has received numerous residencies and awards from the Guggenheim Fellowship, the Rome Prize, the American Institute in Berlin, the list goes on. But I wanted to start with a bit of a personal note. I was telling Sanford the other day, I went to Columbia University in 2016, and it was weird timing, especially, I feel like I've been a secondhand student of Sanford. It was a time where I was receiving a lot of attention and had to in a really weird way, we missed him being present. But I remember sitting in an office that had one of his pieces. It was one of his quilt works with his kind of iconic mandala. And I remember sitting there being like, I want to talk to this person. I want this person in my studio. I remember counting the geometric form, which is something I tend to do. And I remember thinking what it means to make work that has both urgency and complexity, and having that conversation with this one work of art. The other day when I was going through all the exhibitions again and kind of really delving in, there was a moment I had in the Bronx Museum when I was leaving. And it was one of those moments where you laugh at yourself for being melodramatic, or at least I do. But I looked back as I was trying to leave, and I had stayed there for a really long time because the pieces really ask for it. But as I was leaving, I looked back, looked at one of his quilt paintings, and I just had a moment. I was like, it was worth it. It was worth it. Like the education I needed, the conversation I needed was in the work. And I thought about one of his interviews from years ago when he was asked, what is it that he wants? It was like the work in the studio, for the work to be made. That's my weird, long-winded way of welcoming Sanford. Thank you for accepting our invitation. I have so many questions for you that has waited for so long, but yeah, welcome to the Rail Convo.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Thank you for everybody, your tech team, Fong, Brooklyn Rail for all the wonderful things you do, Yasi for staying and connected with me, even though we missed each other in that Columbia span. So I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. I wanted to start with a question that is perhaps complicated, but I don't know how else we can discuss your work. The other day I was thinking about what is the right ritual to have alongside your work, especially thinking about the gravity of your pieces. And I kind of stumbled upon this album between John Cage and Sombra, which is still blowing my mind, like the fact that that happened. I think often when people discuss your work, there are 2 points. There's like the general conversation always falls back to, Nick, can we have the screen so we can look at it? Thank you. But yeah, I think the reductive way is people usually point out to your interest in hip hop culture and your time in Japan. You lived in Japan for 3 years, learned the language. But I was thinking more about your relationship with both meditation and improv. And both of them feel very key to your work. And I think both of them are things I've been asking myself a lot about. So yeah, I wanted to ask you about your thoughts about improv and mindfulness and how that relates to your practice.
Yeah, I see them both as, partners, a duet in some ways, because part of improvisation has to do with being very mindful and being present, being extremely open, and to trust your instinct on when to collaborate with the other. If you're with a group, let's say, if I'm with Moon Medicin in a situation like that, then it's often a lot of listening before I figure out what I can add or put in or interject. And sometimes the silence is just as important as the sound, which I think is actually very poignant in that Cage and Sun Ra collaboration. So I think they both really sort of work in tandem. We're going to have this conversation and we're going to hit a couple of buzzwords. And I just like to remind everyone that those buzzwords sometimes are limitations onto the true meaning of the things we're talking about. And I don't think there's a clean distinction between improvisation and meditation. I think they really sort of feed off of each other.
I was thinking that I would take 10 minutes before I'm like, oh, you blew my mind. I survived for 5 minutes. Nick, can we go through things as we talk? And
absolutely. Yeah,
I ask you to
that's fun.
To things. I started with images of the 3 main things I want to discuss today. Hopefully, we'll go through all of them. And that's the Soft Truth exhibition, Code Switch, and Moon Medicin, because I feel like all of them together kind of show the depth of your work. But to go back to what you were saying, I think the silence part for me, thinking about the complexity of silence feels important. So the reason why I wanted to ask this question, sometimes I find this frustration about like earlier writing around your work. That it's like people are either saying that it's like, it's Buddhist, or they're saying it's political. And there's a lot of people saying, how can it be both Buddhist and political? And I partially think there's something about like whiteness and the US when we say, when Buddhist is used to say formal, passive, and I think people use political to say it's historical, it's about Blackness, it's about US and the complexity of its history. And I think one of the reasons why it has been important to be your secondhand student for myself is to think about how you have emphasized on both urgency and complexity. Mm-hmm. But what I was thinking is, especially with improv and mindfulness in your work, I feel like when I think about like Zen Buddhism, I think about being in the now, right? And when I think about your performances or your influence and inspirations in like Black radical music, I think about, for example, Afrofuturism, like this kind of a longing or a need for a future or an engagement with the past that is urgent, you know? So with that, I kind of wanted to introduce your practice on a larger basis. But yeah, how do you do that? Like, what does it mean to kind of engage with the gravity of the past, the need for the future, or what it means to be marginalized, while making this work that is so much about silence, so much about being present, includes so much mindfulness?
Mm-hmm. Well, once again, I think it's about sort of blurry lines in between all of those. I like to think that we're somewhere in the midst of a simultaneity. Past, present, and future are not in vacuums. They are all in relationship to each other. So, you know, and I think strangely enough, what you said about writings about my work, or early writings about my work being stuck in, you know, a binary, which again, are problematic. Things are not that cut and dry, but a binary of being Buddhist or hip hop or political or passive. But I did a solo exhibition probably around 2004, 2005. And the title of that show was Both and, not either or. So I was really addressing all this stuff very directly in the past. But oddly enough, I don't think people could hear it because they were expecting a certain thing and projecting a certain thing. And I see that in a lot of the early writings as well. Critics that compared me to Kara Walker and David Hammonds because that's the tone that they wanted to get their information from a Black artist from. And I think there's obviously subtlety, nuance, silence, things like that, that were overlooked at that time because somehow that was not attributable to the vernacular of an African-American artist. I think that was very short-sighted, but I think finally the language is starting to catch up. And it's interesting, you mentioned even Afrofuturism in that. And, you know, Afrofuturism is a buzzword of the moment. It started a while ago. But Afrofuturism as a movement textually, you know, obviously goes back to the 90s, and as a thought process goes long, decades before that. So, you know, once again, I see that as part of a continuum. There's always been a need, not just with African Americans, but with people in general, is to project, to fantasize, to idealize, to look forward, to seek brighter days. Because of the optimism that we all naturally have to some degree. It's a survival tactic at its most basic level. So I think for me, that simultaneity of past, present, and future is always involved in all the work. So I consider myself a collaborator with history, but I'm making that right now. And we're talking about it and viewing it now in the present. But obviously, if the work stands the test of time material-wise, and there's people in the audience that still see work, then this will even speak and mean something different to future generations. And there's a phrase, a rarely used phrase or term in Japanese, and I might be botching it because it's been years since I've even tried to use it, but it's something close to onkojushin, or onkojishin, which means basically sort of the same idea as Sankofa, is learning from the past to inform the present, to then change the future.
It's so interesting walking to my studio in preparation for this morning. I was thinking there's this like interview with John Cage just on YouTube where he's talking about silence and kind of being content with the sound of the city and silence, or not needing sound to be something else. And every once in a while, especially in that collaboration, as you said, I think about whether even silence is the same for Sandra and John Cage, and what is that conversation?
I wondered that too, yeah, actually.
Anyway, I feel like I can spend the whole interview, and I kind of want to talk about that album and your work with you. But I wanted to start talking about something that feels really important in your work and has been present since your early project to what's happening now. But I wanted to talk about power objects and your relationship to power objects. Something I found really interesting and kind of moving, and like, I think it was in the recent catalog, but it was mentioned that you were, like in '98, you were assisting this exhibition at the Museum of Natural Histories called The Sacred Art of Haitian Voodoo. And part of your job was to basically take the Haitian priests around New York to think about how to activate these altars. And then the text was vague about it. And it's weird because I'm like narrating your life to you. No, but to everyone. But then it was mentioned that through this, you also ended up in Brazil's Salvador de Bahia. I mention all of this because I think that question of how do you activate these objects that have a past, like what is your engagement with them, feels important. But then the other side of it, thinking about your relationship as an African-American, thinking about the diaspora in Brazil or Haiti. I was thinking about, you mentioned the Cannibalist Manifesto in one of your early catalogs. Not that it made me very happy. That's Carlos de Andres' Cannibalist Manifesto, which is like about Brazil and thinking about also these questions of what is the contemporary, what is this troubled past, and how do we think about a future? And I told you, I'm having a glissant phase, but I was thinking it also about creolization. It's my long-winded way of saying, I would love to hear your thoughts about power objects to introduce soft truth.
Sure. Well, I think those are two concepts that are both interesting to me is the power object, but as you refer to glissant and creolization, I think of it actually, some of my earlier works when I was referencing mandalas and making the breakdance stores and so on, I was really interested in syncretism, which is in relationship to creolization as well. But let's sort of start with the power object. And, you know, I guess that's related to syncretism as well. The power object for me is this notion that objects and even images at this point can be imbued with a certain type of power, whether that be negative or positive or myriad, that it evokes and provokes people and the imagination and even action from time to time. And the interesting thing about those power objects is that they're actually not even fixed. For example, a swastika is a perfect example. We know that begins early. You know, it's a Hindu symbol. So you see it there first. And it actually means sort of like blessings and sun and light. And obviously it has morphed, and we can no longer see it as that frequently because we associate it with Nazi Germany. So that's just sort of to show that you have symbols, archetypes, imagery that have been around for millennia that can be changed by events and usage and propaganda. And for me, a power object acts that way. And my project is really to investigate power objects from all around the world, not just the objects themselves, but the impetus, the literal power embedded in them, and saying, how does that original power sort of mixed with our contemporary culture, contemporary world society, and how we perceive these things, and the disputed notions of the histories of those objects. In particular, the show Soft Truths, when you have these marble pieces where I'm combining aspects of Greco-Roman sculptures and African sculptures from various parts of the continent. It's really, it's a total mashup. So we have these stories and this historical belief that monochromatic marbles are the pinnacle of Western society, Western ingenuity and sculpting. But the reality is a lot of those monochromatic sculptures were at some point painted and adorned. So they aren't these very monochromatic images that we see. So our understanding of that and the use of that as basically propaganda for Western Europe and its project, its expansionist project, are false. The same way as when you look at modernism and its inspiration from those African objects that were imported via books and images and drawings to Europe around the turn of the 20th century. They were denuded. They were monochromatic brown and black wooden sculptures. But in reality, those objects too had raffia and beads and colors and pigment and so on. So you have a whitewash version of history and you've got a blackwash version of history. These inform modernism and postmodernism and everything that we've been doing artistically since. So the basis of that education and that history is based on falsehood. And you can see how that extrapolates and becomes a metaphor for larger societal conditions. I mean, we're living in a moment of soft truth, if there's truth at all. So I wanted to explore some of those concepts in this show, but doing it through art historical reference, but also material. And beyond that, which is, very conceptual and there's an intent behind that, I do still try to allow for some valence and some play and some improvisation so that the end result is less calculated than it is intuitive.
I wanted to step back for a second because I feel like, again, you blew my mind. No, I was thinking about, I think with both shows, for me, it was really moving to have this moment to kind of be in conversation with both of them because they carry a lot of your earlier questions, but much more complicated now. But early on, I feel like for a long time, you've been in conversations about the works where you've used the African sculptures. And something I found interesting is you kind of talk about this notion of like, what is the authentic sculpture and what is the term dubious origin? Like this idea of it can be produced where a museum can approve it, while this object is being produced to be taken away from its context, so it's not activated, it doesn't have that meaning. And this idea of like producing the fake version of it, even though that too is for this consumption. And I think you often talk about how you reference both and collect both and don't even put a hierarchy there. I was also thinking about how you often talk about what it means to the kind of art history you received at home and the type of like narratives of art history you'd learn outside. I was also thinking about like the objects at home that teach you about your history, but also how that may relate to kitsch too. That's a side point.
Well, I think about it like this. The objects themselves, if they still serve a function within a culture, a society, or a family, does that make it any less or real? Does that make it less or more authentic? And provenance, often in the Western usage of it, ultimately ends up who collected that, who ransacked it, who put it in what wing of what museum, and thus it is named the collection of that person, and somehow that establishes the provenance. When in fact, something that could have been made 3 weeks ago actually holds more magnitude and power than that object from 100 years ago. So who's to really say? So when I say dubious origins, I also say that because the Greco-Roman and neoclassical sculptures that I use are usually knockoffs in the first place. When we go to the museums, when we go to the Louvre, when we go to the Met, are we seeing the original piece? We're usually seeing a copy from, and that copy was usually inspired by yet another totally unique sculpture. So the pose might have been lifted from one sculpture and then applied and then now called Athena. And then 200 years later, it's remixed by somebody else and called Slave Girl. So this happens all the time. And you see the same practice in music. So that's why I often liken this to sampling and chopping and screwing of recorded material. But I'm taking full advantage of those dubious origins by concocting and creating these pieces that are in soft truths. So, for example, many of the masks that are on those figures are not from one singular group. They're usually combinations of multiple forms from different cultures. And thus, all of this is from dubious origins. And the contrary effect is that I'm actually creating a unique object, because there is no other object that actually has all of those things. So once again, that's a story. You know, I often refer to these works as objects for a future ethnography. The point being that 100 years from now, when you decipher the elements of one of these pieces, you can't find one true origin. They're prime. They're like, we talked about numerology before. It's like the number 7. It's the virgin number. There's nothing that makes it, and it can make nothing else, you know, under 10. You know, so all that stuff is related, basically. I hope I answered one of the questions in there.
Yeah. You mentioned 7. Now I'm stuck with 7. So I'll come back to 7 another time. No, and then I was thinking, well, I feel like what is really interesting about the Soft Truth show is there is the Greco-Roman references. There's the idea of the African masks, but also there's the quilts. And I find your work with the quilts to like be really important and complicated and moving. And there's a lot about the sampling, but I just wanted to locate it too, to think about quilts as Americana. It's very much, because I think people often talk about how you're influenced by the narrative of how it relates to the Underground Railroad. And we'll go there. But I wanted to think about like this idea of the classical, like Greco-Roman sculpture, the Americana quilts, and this notion of the African sculpture, as if these things can be divided and kind of clean cut. Wait, I had a question somewhere in there. This is what happens when you glance over your notes. This
no problem. Well, you know what? I will say something regarding the quilts. Yes, I think the narrative of them supposedly being used on the Underground Railroad was a jumping off, a station, if you will, to start the project from. And through that thought process, I started to imagine Harriet Tubman as an astronaut, basically navigating the stars to take people to freedom. And, you know, that's just sort of how my mind works. That's how I initially got into working with quilts and seeing them as a material that had a lot of potential, had a lot of power. They were fecund with meaning and history. But when it went beyond that, it started to go into a lot of formal issues. It started to go into a lot of gender issues and labor issues, representation issues, quilts being seen as craft and never sort of at that vaunted status as high art. And then you have the Gee's Bend show at the Whitney, and you know, in the bastion of painting, and these are holding their own, and actually, in my opinion, superior to some of the paintings in the collection. And what that meant in terms of having an all women's art show, an all disenfranchised, typically women from Alabama, the Gee's Bend group in that show, and the political ramifications there, and the museological ramifications there. All of that was interesting. But when you know, if you've seen the show in the Bronx, the Coachwood show, you know that's around 60 plus works in that show. So I'm working out all of these ideas in those pieces. And I think that is definitely almost a diaristic look at how I've been working through literally the materials and the references. By the time you see the quilts in Soft Truths, that's when I'm taking a very different approach. It's less additive, it's more subtractive. It's really mining information, extracting it from these as opposed to charging them with it. And that's because I have a trust for those materials, that they're already speaking on such a powerful plane that my being an interlocutor with them in this situation was to remove or to minimize as opposed to keep adding and adding.
I was so excited to see the piece you have behind you today, because I feel like slightly I can be like that piece. But especially like there's so many subtle gestures and how they kind of point to space. Especially, again, it took 10 minutes before I mentioned this. They made me think a lot about architecture, because I tend to think a lot about Islamic geometry and architecture. So I was thinking about the nuanced gestures. It's interesting, I hadn't thought about yeah, the trust you have with the quilts in Soft Truth. I wanted to talk to you about material. Nick, can we stay with Soft Truth for now? So there's I was thinking about the different materials. So there's the quilts in the sense of like the fabric or like what can cover a body. And I kept going around looking at the stitches, like the stitches as gesture. And like all of these things relate to the figure. I feel like there's a lot about the body in the show. Then there's the marble in the sense of like the coldness of the marble. Even when it feels like it's referencing wood, but it's in marble. And then I was thinking about the pedestals, because for me it was really interesting because the wood was so beautiful and untouched, you know, but it referenced something that made me think about like moving objects and ships and utility. So I wanted to hear more of your thoughts about material, especially in Soft Truth.
Sure. Well, I mean, the name of the show, once again, to decipher most of my work, you just got to read the titles. So Soft Truth is really a play of opposites. It's the hard and the soft. It's the sort of detached coldness of marble, so to speak, and the warmth and invitingness of the quilt. It's about volume and about voids. So all of that is at play there. Yes, the plinths that they're on refer to the actual plinths that they were actually carved on, but they also have that once removed because these are clean and made for the gallery, but they also have wheels on the bottom, so they're made for practical purposes. So it's really just taking aspects of the studio and putting them in place because the ones in the studio need to stay there. And these can be wheeled around and moved for pragmatic purposes. So, you know, and the titles in the show, they all sort of speak to something, you know, they all speak to their own sort of narratives. Like the one in the foreground right there is called Lady Interbellum. And any music or pop fans out there know about the group Lady Antebellum, which for some reason after 12 years in a hit career didn't realize that antebellum had very negative connotations for many people. So they changed their name to Lady A. And then they got into a big dispute because there was already a Black female performer in Las Vegas named Lady A, who had been going by that name for 20 years. And the whole legal suit ensued. And Lady Antebellum said that they were going to let her keep her name and so on. And then they reneged on the whole deal at the end of it. So they colonized her name and took it, or making her pay to use it. So I call this one Lady Interbellum. Also in the sense that, you know, who knows what's really going on in politics in the US right now, but we could be interbellum at the moment as we speak. And the other conceit behind the show, Soft Truths, I did a lot of the thinking for the show while I was at the American Academy in Rome. And I went there with the intent of studying the fall of empire, the phenomena of falls of empire, to try to make sense, you know, looking at the past to make sense of the present and understand the future. And so the works in the show come totally out of that. They reference that. I mean, you see it all in the work. The double height quilt that's in the background in some of these shots is called Wince. Wince, W-H-E-N-C-E, W-I-N-C-E. And next, keep going.
I think this is it. So,
no, keep going, that one right there. Yeah, so, you know, those are from the Parthenon for the corner columns, draped down, flaccid, lying on the floor, splayed, of red, white, and blue quilts. It's very basic. And it's sort of looking at the pillars of democracy, basically, and what they stand for, if they stand for anything at the moment. So it's all about wince, you know, all the phraseology that comes as win from Shakespeare all the way down the line, and then wincing at might come next. Let's see, I'm trying to think of any other titles that are coming to mind at the moment. We can get into that later. I know I'm going off tangent, so you got to bring me back, reel me back.
Yeah, I was like, Nick, go further, go back. No, I mean, Sanford, I had a moment. So I had my experience with, for me, the first moment was between God Whistle and the Untitled piece in the back room, and like that conversation because it almost felt like it was sacred, or it was like, do I want to interrupt it or not? Then I had a whole moment about the material, like kept going back and forth. Like, again, like I was like, that wood is beautiful, and I did not expect to be focused on that wood. We're making this as hard as possible for Nick, but Nick is great. And then I finally started looking at the names. And it's funny because I'm a foreigner, so I feel like I had to like Google shit. And then I was thinking about our conversation today, and I was like, Sanford, you cannot expect me to say, like, to read these things. I have an accent. Like, what do you want from me? I was thinking about whence and whence. But there's all these kinds of plays. For me, though, it felt really intense to think about, like, Lady Interbellum, kind of that gaze, like looking back at that tension between Caligula and Ascendant. I think that's the name, right? And then, like, they seem to be in some sort of intense conversation, and I read Caligula like with this mask, but it's like this white masculine body wearing this mask and thinking about the character of Caligula. And then suddenly I'm like, oh, that painting in the back, like right behind Lady Interbellum, is called Orpheus. And then I'm thinking about all the things that Orpheus can mean or refer to, and kind of their protection. And then I had Charlotte on the other side that almost looks like an attire. So there was this whole theater happening with me just being blown away by the conversations between the names. And then it was interesting because I spent a long time being like, I love the idea of like God whistle, but it also reminded me of this joke Fong likes telling all the time that it's about dog, God, and like that kind of a term.
Yes, exactly.
At one level, I was thinking about like, oh, like what is a whistle? Like what is that gesture? What is that kind of sound? Or is it kind of an ironic moment, or there's something about like, oh, like I get it. It's like dog's whistle, but it's God whistle. I actually Googled God whistle, and Google was like, you mean dog whistle?
Good. Well, you know, I will say a lot of the wordplay with these titles, and you'll see this in a lot of my very recent work, sometimes you can hear the pun or the riddle when you hear it sonically. Sometimes you have to read it to get it. So, you know, it's not always coming at you on the same pitch. And then sometimes, in a strange way, it allows for certain pieces to be untitled because, you know, some pieces just have to be untitled. It's just the best way. There's a balance there to be achieved. But my favorite title in the show, I think, might be Kubrick's Rube, the one in the corner. If you had a picture of that. Anyone who hasn't seen the show should actually go see this work, because it's going to do a lot more for you in person than it will via your screen, hopefully. And if you're in New York City, particularly, and you have the time, which theoretically you should have the time, go see the show at the Bronx Museum and go see the show at Marianne Boesky, because I think they are having a conversation with each other. And it's really sort of a deep exploration into these materials.
The Cubic Rube was the only joke I got as a foreigner. I was like, oh, because I'm a nerd and I know Cubic cubes. Like, this one I get. But Sanford, you're highly doing your segue, and I'm not good at segue. But yeah, maybe that's a good place to start thinking about the show at the Bronx. And I feel like it's an important show. But I was thinking about your relationship with language. So we specifically talked a lot about the usage of language here. But there's something you said a long time ago where it was like you were talking about the difference of, like, when you were young, you lived in Italy for a year, learning to speak Italian, and then you moved to Japan and learned, maybe longer too, but learned to speak Japanese. But you were talking about the difference, where it's like with English and Italian, you can kind of translate. You can kind of be like, okay, this is the sentence I want in English, and this is what it is in Italian. Whereas with Japanese, it's like kind of a completely different it's a different paradigm. Like you have to move through it differently. So I was thinking about the show at the Bronx Museum is called Code Switch, and you talk about how in this like almost a decade of working with the quilts, you've talked about them as codex, or thinking about the language that may already be in these objects, like in the quilts you collect. And as you mentioned before, it's like both thinking about kind of this myth or the story of how they were used to signify how they were used for the Underground Railroad, to suddenly think about Tubman as like a astronaut. There's also this like very intense photograph of a like the back of a slave been whipped, and you kind of talked about that as a constellation, like looking at the image and finding meaning.
The scars, yeah.
The scars. So language feels very different here. It's like, it almost feels like what's beyond language. And the other thing we talk a lot about with these is like trusting your hand, or what your hand knows, or kind of engaging with the material to understand what has been done on these quilts that are collected. You mentioned G's band already. So funny, I think Tomas is here and he tends to yell at me about like what it means to trust the hand as the artist. I'm like, see, this is my hand moment. Talk about hands. Yeah, I wanted to kind of, I think that's maybe a good way to begin talking about Code Switch. Language or refusal language.
Sure. You know, in the works in Code Switch, also another reason, you know, I trust the hand, but I also trust the material is because, again, I consider myself basically a late collaborator with groups of women, typically, sometimes men, but quilt makers, you know, over a century ago. And a lot of these quilts were on their way to the dustbin. Some I purchased, some were gifted to me, and all of them were basically living in the shadows. So to bring them out and to basically live with them for sometimes years at a time before ever making a mark on them, part of that is to learn and figure out how to navigate each particular quilt. So in that way, there is a lot of trust. And there's
sorry, I just want to check.
bobbing in it works. I have to bob and weave with them. What's that?
I think you got cut for a bit in the middle.
Hello?
I couldn't hear you for a second.
Oh.
No,
I think my mic might have fallen. How's that? Is that better?
It's good. I think it was your internet glitching.
Okay.
The fun life of Zoom.
Oh, okay.
And I think you have like,
So
I think we have like a couple of seconds of a lag.
Oh, okay. All right. Is this going okay right now, me speaking?
Yeah.
Okay. So as I was saying, basically, you know, I have to sit and deal and consider each of these actually very intensely before making any moves, making any marks on them. And sometimes I'm totally guided by the pattern or the color combination of the quilt itself. And sometimes I have to mine and go a little bit deeper and try to drag something out. Sometimes if I squint my eyes, I see the painting already happen. Other times I have to put it away for months at a time before I come back to it. So some of the more successful ones have taken me years to do because they just kick my ass for 3 or 4 years at a time, and then I'd have to return to it. And then some of them, you know, you wake up and it's like, oh, this has to happen right now. So, but you know, I guess all that is to say that these are all very sort of, this is like going through a sketchbook. This is like real studio. This is less heady in some ways than some of my projects. It started from a very heady conceptual place, but it later started to go into a deeply formal hands material-based place.
Yeah, that's why I feel like.
Oh, you know what? Let me mention one thing because you have it up right now. On the ground right now is the mandala of the Bee Bodhisattva. And this is the oldest piece in the show. And that goes to around 2000, 2001. And what you're looking at is a dance floor that I made out of hand cutting pieces of rubber tile to create basically a mandala. And above that mandala, we installed a video camera. I was working with David Ellis, AKA Squirm, on this particular one that you see here, because it later became the official dance floor for the Battle of the Boroughs breakdance competition that happened at the Bronx Community College in 2000. And we videotaped that event, and I was later asked to be in a show at the Bronx Museum by Lydia Yee and Franklin Sermons called One Planet Under a Groove. And that was one of the pieces that I had in the show. So it was the actual dance floor, and then a very small monitor had the video, which showed the dancing. So in Soft Truths, in Code Switch, we've projected that video down onto basically a platform on the ground. So it looks like the dance floor mandala itself, but you also see the dancing take place on it. So if you go there, that's a live action video. But that's in there not only because of the Bronx connection, but the patterns that I was exploring in the early mandala works from the late 90s to early aughts really was the gateway to going deeper into pattern. And quilt then became the next vessel of exploring pattern. So I see them as totally related.
See, you're saying for me. So I was, yeah, I mean, I think that was it was kind of a gift to see that piece within everything, because I started thinking about your earlier work, what you were doing, these patterns, or even doing like sand painting of mandalas. But I was thinking about the language of these forms, whether it is like Far East, again, like Islamic or Judaic designs and patterns, to like thinking about language of abstraction in Congo and how these forms travel. And like the meaning kind of shifts in your work. But I also find it really moving that, especially in those works, you also talked about breakdancing and thinking about the cyclical movement. You even mentioned that there's this idea of like going beyond the sand painting, the monks can know how to move their body. And that becomes the mandala. Like there's no longer even the need for any kind of material in between. But what I found really moving about the Bronx Museum, just kind of intense, is like each of the pieces kind of open up in different moments and different layers. I had times where I was just like, again, thinking about like the different designs and counting and thinking about how things come together. There are different kind of, you always return to the tree. The tree was around, and the tree both as, and this existed in some of your most iconic earlier work, but thinking about the tree both as thinking about the history of lynching and thinking about where Buddha found enlightenment. So, but here the tree repeats too, and you never know. It's both and neither. And the same.
Well, the use of the trees in this particular show in Code Switch, and all the works here, these really are the sketches of all the other installations. There are the references to the pianos and the bonsai and the kimono and the trees and silhouetted figure form. All of this is the palimpsest of reading all of my work. That's why I call it the Codex series. So on a larger level, you can look at this as sort of almost the pages of a sketchbook that would later become larger installations. And also I consider, the quilts themselves, and I want to say this in relationship to the question you asked about the Soft Truths exhibition, is you recanted the story that I was saying about monks often not even drawing or representing a mandala, but remembering the movements and dancing them in circle. And I was really struck by that, the image that put in my head of sound pieces with no sound, kinetic pieces with no movement, performative works that don't actually, quote unquote, perform in the literal sense. But with that being said, I consider these quilts to rest somewhere on that precipice because they are performative objects. Your body relates to them immediately because they are made for your body. But once they're on the wall with that removed, then they start speaking a different language, the language of drawing and tapestries and paintings. So they're vacillating between multiple spaces. And so I consider those to be performative as well.
It's so interesting. This morning I was thinking about the word auto-ethnography, and I was again, I love like reading early interviews and getting frustrated about like the language around art in the early 2000s. Might have some anger. But people constantly asked you when it came to the socio-political questions if it is autobiographical. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's just like about not being a white American, like, which is a lot of the world. And then this morning I was like, oh yeah, like it's interesting. More recently we talk about ethnography. And then I nerded out. I hadn't seen the word future ethnography until like right before our interview. I was like, oh, that's a good one. Like future ethnography is a good one. But that also makes me think, I was also, again, I'm like a newbie nerd. I actually asked the student to help me nerd out in the history of hip hop. I was like, I want the real thing, lead my way. And she did great. But I had a moment yesterday where I was like, oh, breakdancing, like kind of focusing on that in between of different musics, like sampling to focus on that in between moment. And that seems to be related to what we're saying about silence too.
Oh, I'm sorry, you glitched out. You said the breakbeat?
Yeah,
like
break thinking about
in the middle of the song?
How that relates to this question of silence, or
well, you know, it's the dirge, it's silence. That's the meditative space. That's when the frequencies become repetitive, and that's where you go into the transcendent moment. Ethnomusicologists talk about that all the time. And I also think, you know, if Harriet Tubman is an astronaut, then, you know, early hip hop DJs are time travelers, because they literally are splicing time. And through that, they're causing the audience and the crowd to go into break dancing, fits, house dancing, fits, you name it, any kind of dance. That's where they go because of that manipulation of time.
See, I'm like, you're blowing my mind. I need a break. No, I wanted to talk about, you mentioned the cloths kind of referring to the body, and the first piece of the Bronx show is a video that is related to Moon Medicin called Moonrise. And it's directed by Nance, who made the Random Acts of Flyness, which is, again, is blowing everyone's mind. But there, the cloth is also like covering the naked body, and there's so much about the music. I do want us to talk about Moon Medicin because it feels important.
Sure.
One of the videos you often use for, like, in your Moon Medicin performances is the trilogy you made with the artist, performer, cool creature, Ricardo. I thought the story you used, like the story behind how the two of you met, felt really important to me. I think the way you mentioned it is like being on a bus in Stuttgart, seeing this kid who's wearing hip hop gear, trying to ask him, but not knowing enough German to be able to ask him. And then this other Black man in the bus laughing and helping you translate. And Ricardo is Afro-Brazilian. And then the two of you becoming friends through this encounter. And in the trilogy, one part is in Stuttgart, and it's kind of like, there's so much about it, but also what it means to be in Stuttgart, right? Or your conversations about what it means to be a Black man in Stuttgart. And then there's the return or going to Salvador de Bahia, but like at this point, this going to, for Ricardo is also, he's lived in Germany longer than Salvador de Bahia. And then you kind of, the trilogy ends in Ethiopia. But for me, there was a point where I'm like, oh, that does everything that we're talking about language, right? Or that thing that doesn't fit in language. It's my long-winded way of saying, can we talk about Moon Medicin?
Sure. Well, the video that the trilogy you're referring to is Shuffle, Shake, Shatter, The Carnival Within. And it is a trio of videos. The first one shot in Stuttgart, second one in Salvador de Bahia, and the third one in Ethiopia, northern Ethiopia, near the Danakil depression. And I consider it a very loose origin story, basically. And that origin story is in reverse. So it goes from Ricardo living in Europe and then going back to Brazil and then finally to Ethiopia. None of this is ever mentioned in any of the films. You don't know where you are. These are all sort of abstracted landscapes. And I left out a lot of information purposefully. And although I've shown aspects of those videos as projects in museums and exhibitions, I also reserved a lot of B-roll to use as background video footage for Moon Medicin, my performance ensemble. So that Ricardo character, the main character, ends up being sort of the common denominator in most of the Moon Medicin performances. We are performing to him. He is traversing through time and the planets, but he needs information. And we're giving him that Moon Medicin. We're giving him that information for him to travel and to disseminate that information in all of his travels. Yes, it's, very sci-fi, very sort of out there. But the clip that that's in the background right there. So the band itself is comprised of mainly 5 people right there. Myself on keyboards, Mark Hines on technology and electronics. I'm back.
You're back.
Where's the music come from? You guys hear that music? Is that just me?
Oh, that's just you.
Hold on. Somebody sing to me here. Who is this? Is that Napalm?
Taking over.
That is hilarious. You guys can't hear that. I don't even know where it's coming from. That is so bizarre.
It's still there?
Totally. Check iTunes, but my iTunes is closed. Sorry, technical glitch, everyone. Let's we'll get through this.
Should I,
iTunes.
Yasi, would you perhaps want me to play the video clip we have?
Sure.
Oh yeah, go for that. Good time.
Yeah.
Okay, just one moment.
Got it. Okay.
Perfect.
That's bizarre.
Like we kept talking about like failure of language and music, and then music was like, stop talking, I'll play. It took over.
I think they put on my mic that played something. But yeah, go ahead and play the video anyway. It will say more than I can.
Face down in the river. Face down in the river. Bang, bang, 2 in the sky. Let them shots off like the 4th of July. It was a hot night out on the streets, trying to sell some music for something to eat. Don't stop, live on the scene, looking all around the money-making machine. It's a rat race, live and let die, fighting the decay for my piece of the pie. 'Cause I feel the city's trying to squeeze me out. And it's times like these I have to stand my ground, or I'll be face down in the river. I'm praying for you.
Okay.
Okay.
So that was at the Kennedy Center. I think it was last year. I'm sitting here watching time dry. I can't remember anything. I think that was 2019 at the Kennedy Center. And every performance is different. Every performance is a bit of a different playlist. The common attributes per performance is a large video presence. And we usually have masks on. Those masks have been with us for a while. And we usually have guests that join us. And they range anywhere from musicians to poets to actors to comedians, including like Rich Medina and Andre Simone, who is the original bassist for Prince, his first Minneapolis group. Michelle and Ocello joined us when we were at Kennedy Center.
I was, there's this interview you did years ago with Terry Atkins, and it's such a special moment. It's just like two artists that care about each other talking to each other. But you have a piece in the Bronx Museum that is called The Tyranny of Mirrors, and it kind of slightly fucked me up. And something about it is how you think about space, but also the title. It felt like a portal, but it also felt intense. I wanted to go back to a quote from your interview with Atkins. You mentioned, you were talking about this quote by Ishmael Reed. Now I'm quoting you. Saying that all Black people, especially Black men, are always under the spotlight, whether it is on a stage, in the spotlight of society, a police car spotlight, or an interrogation light. I'm sure it extends beyond African American or Black men, but this was the specific code. And with that in mind, I felt there was no real difference between my doing a performance act in a gallery or a museum, or my standing up and speaking my opinion in an all-white academic environment. It's just that's just too real. And then I feel like, if I'm not wrong, Atkins, you design the clothes and the attire, all of it feels really important with Moon Medicin. You had this early piece called the Ghetto Bird that referenced to how helicopters hover over Black neighborhoods to kind of police it all the time. I think your idea was can you wear this and move freely as a Black, would you dare to survive to move freely as a Black man? And that makes me think about your early piece, even in Skohegan, going in the jungle, going in the woods and playing music. And both being completely moved by it, but also thinking about what the trees can mean. I think that's why I feel like the inclusion of Moon Medicin with everything you do feels so important. Is this a question? I think it's a question. I want to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think Moon Medicin offers a different voice, and it operates in a very different way. Music for me seems, it has an ability to speak to people in a different way than visual art does. Unfortunately. Or maybe fortunately, I don't know. It's not a pejorative, but I just think they operate and function in different ways. And music on some levels doesn't need as much translation, and it can reach more people because of the modes of distribution and the way we sort of understand and perceive and receive that information. And through Moon Medicin, I'm able to very spontaneously tackle a lot of issues that I don't necessarily address in my visual practice. Some I do, but many I don't. And it's really influenced by a lot that was happening with the early surrealists and the theater of the absurd and dark humor and Black humor, which permeates into my visual practice at times. I think I work, have different tonalities even in my visual practice. But when it comes to the performative realm with Moon Medicin, it can go very dark, it can go very dank, it can go very dirty. But at the end of the day, it's also trying to find a sense of liberation. Liberation from the confines that society projects on artists of color, but also a liberation through the nonsensical in some way, the nonlinear, and the non-narrative. So I think that's the space that it operates in. And even as a group, it's got a loose formation. We do collaborations with all kinds of people. We have different, directors come and direct our performances. In some ways, it's an open source collaboration tool. One of the reasons there is not much available online right now is because we're actually sort of revamping what it means to exist online right now. There's so much potential, yet we're so inundated by invitations to be online all the time. And we're really trying to figure out what is the right space to occupy in that format, because we have tons of content to put in that format. We want to do it justice. I think it would be the third pillar too to my practice, and another mode of expression.
This kind of brings me all the way back to my first question. And I guess like the reason why I was like, I'm still so stuck in like wanting to hear your thoughts about meditation and improv. So sometimes I wonder if it's like, what does it mean to ask people to meditate on something that is heavier? You know, it's like let's meditate on like society and oppression, and like that as an invitation. And then,
You know, it's sort of funny. When you get into deep meditation, there's obviously many forms. There's eating meditation, there's walking meditation, there's sitting meditation. And as you say that, I think about existence as a marginalized person in the US, that every day when you're walking under oppression, that's walking oppression, that's eating oppression, sleeping oppression. It's a constant. So maybe there is a correlation. Maybe you can find some therapy through it.
So interesting. I was like once in this program where it was all about like meditating on objects and like not discussing studium. And all my friends were like, Yasi, you're going to lose it. Because like you mentioned politics all the time. And my last night I got drunk, and in the morning, like, who has this as a blackout story? Everyone was like, Yasi, how's colonialism? Seems like I talked a lot about colonialism after being really good for a whole week and not mentioning it. But yeah, I think that is the experience of being marginalized in society. There's like, when I'm asked not to think about oppression, I'm asked to pretend like I'm within whiteness somehow. But then Fred Moten is offering this class right now called The Language of the Unheard. And he's thinking about the MLK quote, and he's thinking about—
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm thinking about what you just said. And I'm thinking about that in relationship to what we were talking about with Moon Medicin. And even abstraction, to a degree, is really finding ways to express that are not based on the binary and not based on opposition to something else, that can be autonomous and of its own. I think that goes back to Glissant too, and creolization and his idea of what opacity.
Right. Sanford, I was waiting for this to be part of my like extra questions. I'm trying to be good to time. I'm like, as your secondhand student, I'm like, what about a right to opacity? No, you brought up opacity.
Yeah, this is the right to opacity. Yeah, yeah.
And it's slippery. That also makes me think about your interview with Atkins, and both of you were talking about this idea of like the double consciousness and Du Bois and double consciousness. And in that moment, you were talking about how things have changed but haven't. And obviously in the last 10 years, things have changed but haven't. And I guess like that's related to what I was saying in the beginning, how it's kind of really moving and important to see how you negotiate that when it comes to importance of opacity in your work. Whereas like I assume the art world would love to like get rid of that because it's easier. Wait, okay, this was the second thought, and then I promise soon I'll be done with my rambling thoughts. I was thinking about Fred Moten's language of the unheard. Just like thinking about the meaning of riot and as like a socio-political way. But at one time he was like, can we think about the language of the unheard as like improv? And when you are within an improv, are you listening to your own instrument or others? Or are you doing both at the same time? And is that the kind of conversation that can happen? Can that be the language of the unheard? All of this to say, I guess like that's what I was asking you about mindfulness when the body is the site of politics and oppression. And then on the other end, like what it means to improv with people. That for me also relates to why it feels complicated to just have Moon Medicin documentations just left online, because it feels like if you're in the room, you're part of the virtual, you're kind of within it. Okay, I threw a lot of random thoughts at you. I'm done.
Well, yeah, I think that is one of the, well, addressing what you said about Moon Medicin, I think that is one of the things that makes it very difficult to just encapsulate as archival footage, because it's really so much about the experience. we usually don't just exist on the stage. We're in the audience. The audience comes up on the stage. There's porous boundary. And that's one thing that I think is important about mirroring and performance, is that I am not so interested in a separation between the performer and the audience. I'm actually more interested in seeing how everyone is projecting onto each other and how everyone is performing in a very complicated dance. And I guess that somehow addresses what you're saying with improvisation. In my opinion, for me as an improviser, it is focus on the external data coming at you and responding to that, as opposed to in solidarity creating my own soundscape that's going outwards. So mine is sort of like a sponge. There's a reflexivity on my end. I think it would probably differ from person to person, and depending on how the improv is set up. I mean, sometimes an improv is set up to be like, everyone go at it, or everyone pull back into minute number 3. You know, there's sometimes very loose paradigms you can work within. Yes. Now you had Moten in there too, and now I'm doing backflips trying to figure out how to tie all that together.
Sorry.
So maybe now's a Q&A time.
Can I ask the final? It's not a question. I just wanted to wrap up the conversation. There was this moment in the Code Switch show where, again, thinking about my own rituals, I was like, okay, now is the right time to listen to the documentary of like New York Times on G's band. And there's a moment within that documentary where one of the older women, she kind of says something along the line of like, oh, I can choose to put this in there or not. She's like, if other people don't like it, who cares? It's going on my bed. And this is after they're talking about like the history of like what it, like that saying it's going on my bed feels important. So I was within this, and then like with my giant headphones, and then I heard this older woman talking to one of the museum people, and she was like, I want to sit. She was like, I want to be with this, like negotiating with the institution. I mean, like, do you have a folding chair? And then she literally paused. She was like, because this is beautiful. And that pause felt important. And I must say, Sanford, like the Bronx Museum, it was a lot of local people. I was kind of shocked by it. And you have this like video of yourself on this like weird monitor that has a body. But you kind of acknowledge this kind of complicated being in that room right now. You kind of just open, you're like, thank you for being here. It's kind of an odd time. But then I was sitting on the floor because I'm who I am, and a bunch of other people were sitting in their different corners. And the way the show is created, there's all these hallways. You have to pause in different moments. And then I started noticing how everyone was spending their time coding, decoding, reading, taking notes. There was something about it that felt related to how that woman said it's going on my bed. Yeah, that's my final note, to say thank you for the work.
My pleasure, my pleasure. And everybody go see these shows while they're up. Soft Truths is at Marianne Boesky until December 12th. And Code Switch is at the Bronx Museum until mid-January. And you need to make an appointment, so check online.
Yeah, please. We'll share some links in the chat if you need some more info. I think it's January 24th, but I may be mistaken for Code Switch.
Okay.
So let's firstly thank you both for this generous conversation and for brightening our day. But we have time for a couple of questions. So I am going to hand the mic over to Susan first.
I also want to thank, this has been an absolutely wonderful event. Thank you, Sanford Biggers, and also Yasi Alipour and the Brooklyn Rail. I love the far-ranging, the way the mind has just been moving through all these places. And I had to tune out sometimes. But the question that I want to which I came to early on, is that I'm wondering, because you have this, there's a certain visionary quality to the work you do. Would you agree to that statement?
Yeah, I had never really thought about it in those terms, but now that you say that, Perhaps there is.
You'll go for it. Okay.
Perhaps, yeah, I'll take it. I'll take it.
Okay, good. Well, with all the allusions to consilience and all your Jungian, your ethnographic, your Buddhist, your various spiritual traditions, etc. There's been a real study, and of course you're a visual artist among other things, so that there's something about vision there. So the thing that really was striking me was I'd like to know what you think about this being a time based on the realities which we are presented with, because you're very aware of those. I don't have to articulate them. If this is a time when people might come together and there might be a re-emergence, amongst other things, of the power of the feminine. Since you are dealing with that in a very deep way, and I'm going back to things I haven't studied in years. And so it's just a little bit of synchronicity that I should come to this today, because I was on that route for another reason. So what do you think of my question about the place of the feminine? And I'm talking with a capital F here, and I'm talking of the binary of masculine and feminine that was given to us as a play out by Jung, but obviously existed far before Jung and went back to Chinese civilization. But anyway, what do you think of that?
I'm all for it. I believe it. I think in some ways what you're seeing around the world is a total resistance to it. And thus you're seeing sort of the hyper-masculine, chauvinistic, authoritarian voice reassert itself, because I think they might know that the end is nigh. Another conceit is that Moon Medicin, the name itself is based off the sacred feminine.
Well, I didn't know about, I figured
that power. Yeah.
So the 28-day cycle.
You know, it's so funny. I don't talk about these things so much because I sort of assume people who are going to get it. So thank you for getting it.
No, but the point is that we can't just speak to people who get it.
I'd like that to be the case.
We can't, Sanford, we can't just
the word's
speak
out
to
there,
people
so
who
it
get
gets
it.
there. But yeah.
We have to start speaking to the people who don't get it. That's the problem.
Well, I mean, you know, as an author, being an artist and person who puts the work out there, I hope they come. I hope we can get them there. The information is out there for people to drink from. It's whether they're led to that water or not, you know, or whether they are able to perceive it. And we're in a very strange time that I have not seen before, where I mean, it's a deeper conversation. I think it has a lot to do with technology as well, and our evaporating attention spans, our inability to deal and grapple with nuance, and looking for the easy out of a binary categorization. Yes, deeper conversation, but I tend to agree with you, and I hope that we see that come around in very soon. As soon as possible.
Thank you, Susan and Sanford. Our next question is coming from Sean Capone. Sean, I'm going to hand you the mic.
Oh, hello.
Hey.
Can you hear?
Yes.
How you doing?
Hey, nice to meet you. Whenever I think about your stuff, your work, I always kind of refer back to the New Yorker profile from a few years ago. There's one quote in it that always really stuck with me, which was, I think it was you responding to, or it was a response to a criticism of the Fat Albert piece, where it said, it was an odd critique suggesting that a work of art must narrow its focus, becoming less specific, that it must, in a sense, mean less. And I thought that kind of spoke to the core of a lot of what you do with, you know, pattern and decoration and abstraction. So the question is, can you speak to the use of ambiguity and abstraction in work that has a social or political intention, whereas you know, some artists might choose to go in a more didactic or illustrative route?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Sure. I've thought about that for, I mean, all of my career, to be honest with you. And I think it does come back to sort of a liberation that, to be liberated by opacity. I'm not really so interested in providing my sentiments upon one particular issue or subject. I'm more interested in provoking complicated thought about those things. It's not for me to provide the answer. It's for me to like try to provoke a better question or a more complicated question. And sometimes I may succeed and sometimes I may fail, but that's more the goal. As opposed to saying, my beliefs are this and this is how it should be. It's not a moral, didactic, right or wrong, pejorative, binary situation for me. And I think the use of abstraction and ambiguity allow for a deeper read and the space for the viewer to interject themselves, their belief and their experiences into the work, so that I'm not spoon feeding. I'm only nudging a little bit here and nudging a little bit there. The rest is for the viewer to figure out. And optimally, if there's more than one viewer at a time and they have a conversation, they're both filling in the gaps for each other. But the work itself is really a platform for those things to take place. It's not a top-down hierarchy for me. It's not a top-down communication process. Oh, and by the way, that Fat Albert, I like to produce it Fatal Bert.
Fatal Bert.
Well, thank you so much, Sean and Sanford. I know we have to keep on schedule today. I'm going to hand the mic over to Fong for our final remarks. Fong, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Sanford. I'm so happy.
Hey, what's up?
Great to see you. Thank you.
Yeah, see you too.
Yeah, I don't really have much to say except that the show is fantastical, and I just had I just have a long conversation with the Astagate yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
and then thinking about the whole immersiveness of all, how certain artists for longest time, I think, were considered to be the hedgehog. We all kind of reminded of Isaiah Berlin's famous essay that was published in 1953. It's called The Hedgehog and the Fox, but didn't really become famous until it was published in 1977 here in New York through, I believe it was Viking Press, and that was included in his collected essay under the name Russian Thinkers. And when that essay hit the Academy, it gave the clarity or the decision that had to be made, just so that people will know the hedgehog and the fox meant the division between two different artistic and intellectual temperament. Why the hedgehog might be able to conceive and perceive the world, all the events in the world, but it has to be filtered through one singular vision, one reading. Whereas the fox, have scattered, diffuse mind to whom the world cannot be boiled down in singular reading. So in the art world, we can say that Bob Ryman, Ernest Martin, perhaps, is the hedgehog, whereas Joseph Beuys or Louise Bourgeois is a fox. What's so interesting to me, my own observation recently, is that a lot of artists like yourself, like Fiesta, even the young, Titus Gaffar is trying to do the same. Is that open up a greater opportunity, open up a greater freedom without having conformed into, as I love what you just say just now, the idea of spoon feeding. the greater complexity means greater freedom to fulfill that ambition. And to me, that is so interesting. What I also heard the first question about in regard to the work, having a certain aspect of femininity, you know, which is, again, I thought of Serena Sat the same way when she came to the scene after the Woman of Allah in '92 and so on. It's essentially trying to open up that have been otherwise read very readily with the limitation minus, you know, Edward Said Orientalism. It's like, you know, Muslim man oppressing woman, Muslim woman, and same thing in Black community. So many male portray had been also sidelined for the same reason, you know. So I think what you do in the work is also amplify that complexity and ultimately generosity in the end. And the timing, it couldn't be better, Sanford, really. So I'm just super happy to see the show. It brought me so much pride. You know, pride in the sense that's deeper profoundly for the universality of art. And so thank you for coming to be here and sharing your narrative with us, finally. You know, and the band sounds great. I can't play. I mean, I can't wait to get in live, man. I can't wait. Thank you, Sanford.
Oh yeah. You gotta see it live.
I can't wait. Okay. I mean, I can't wait. Thank you so much. I'm so tickled. Love it.
Thank you, Phong. That's what's going to hold us, keep us holding on in quarantine. That we can see that and engage in that again one day. Moon Medicin, I mean. But well, I want to thank everyone. Thank you, everyone, for your questions that we weren't able to get to. I want to respect Sanford. I know that you had to head out at 2:30, but I want to thank you all for being here today. A generous thanks to Marianne Boesky Gallery again for sponsoring today's talk. The links are in the chat. Please, if you're in New York or in the area, do go see those shows at the Bronx Museum, and which is up through January, and Boesky, which is up through December 12th. So we have a tradition at the end of our conversations here at the Rail by ending them with a poem. I will read a very quick bio and then hand the mic over to our poet. Today we are joined by Isabel Sobral Campos, who is the author of several books of poetry, including the collection Your Person Doesn't Belong to You from Vegetarian Alcoholic Press in 2018, which I need to look up immediately after this. There are many other books and amazing things that Isabel has written that we'll share some info in the chat, but for now, I'm going to hand the mic over to you, Isabel.
Hey, thanks so much. I'm so happy to be here today. And I'm going to read from my long poem, How to Make Words a Rebel. I'll just read 5 minutes of it, okay? Thanks for listening. Scrap for new orology. First, nights ache, window panes shatter, the slow appoggiatura falters. Grendel's mother paces in her fabricated time signature, halting between glooms. Shadows time-stamp my face. Night is neurosis, plummeting, irrotational, earth, maternal. Second, the tempest whose transmarine tinge will erase the globe is here, halfway into Zamek hourglass, showering, anti-mosaic monument, trigonometry applied. Again, the sun extends midway between buildings. Daughter sleeps esoteric devolution I shatter with bloody hands. Grendel's mother won't leave until I breed a protective force. I have reached her diuretic vision of the world. 0. Chronometry stabbed on rock. Scrap for new orology. Multiply. I expect it to move smoothly over liquid whose names are many, to absorb spatial recognition. How do oceans and rivulets breathe comparatively when Dada asks, how much is this estuary of glitter? How many mythic beings lift their hands before she shakes her head? How much air inside water? The delta she loves more than sky. She waits at the cusp of water without looking back, where I stand, rake in hand. Partition. The age of tree, in its distended chronology, measures ear, diffracts, jitters. Grendel's mother tells time through the cell-line content of her belly. I tell time through weeds. Daughter knows it like bone. More. Chronometry unleashed, wind curls uncloaking time. Scrap for new orology is rebel. Scrap for new orology, disordered clumps expressing condition of sediment, variety of fragment, aptly plural on human. So many pieces with faces, granite lips. Grendel's mother, whose moves of stone sentience command me toward metrical footfall. Footfall, plip, plip, plop. Nice speck in my throat, snapping words with fragments. On years of daughter, I chant beginning my rock protectorate, overlay. You brush the wind from my face with your small hand, used to bathe an old mother's body. When Grendel as grief returns, jutting through brickwork layered with scars, I have marked the stink of emotion. Each tree delineates past tremor, the rub of Grendel on winter's back. Scrap for new orology, penitentiary. It's getting late. Grendel's mother exhales winter. Clouds spit drizzle. Our threefold body gendered altar pops. Strange soda, tiny pattering tongues. Everyone gazes when sand bursts from the colossal hourglass, turbine wind over crushed grass. Black stone poses, atemporal, the mouth, moth, choked world. Ruined. I walked, drenched in my naked thought, slumbering motherwise. Outside, time bowed surfaces, gravely walked in the center of her spiritual name. A glowing roundness spoke. Oh, strip me of my body parts of rock fragment. Oh, line them with moss. Scrap for new orology, timely sob. I wear taboo on my body as often as Grendel's mother speaks from her dungeons with her slow gesture of time, more than a mood or a substance. Her constitution is crater-like, an abstract similar to stump in her moorland. 9 mouths. Only motherhood withstands the cave a rock abhors. Shut human eyes, each month sewed on skin. When it terrifies, roaring, razor skin sheep. Thank you so much. How to Make Things a Rebel. It was a really lovely, lovely conversation. So nice to meet you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel. And thank you again, Sanford and Yasi, for your wonderful conversation today. Stay tuned for something that may come after. We do this every day at 1 p.m. Please join us tomorrow at the same time, same place for a conversation with sculptor Jean Silverthorne with Rail Consulting editor Douglas Dreischpoon. We'll conclude with a poetry reading from Kate Colby. I also want to note that October 2020, although it's now November, is the 20th anniversary of the Brooklyn Rail, and we are committed to remaining free and accessible to all people and put on great events like this. So without any more words, you are all now free to turn on your mics to say hello or goodbye on your way out, and have a lovely, wonderful day.
Thank you, Sanford. Thank you, Yasi and Isabel.
Hi.
Thanks, Sanford and
Thanks,
Yasi.
everyone.
Thanks, Isabel.
Thanks,
Great
Isabel.
poem.
Thanks.
Fun.
Wonderful questions, Yasi. So good to hear you, Sanford.
Thank you, Sanford.
Wonderful.
Thank you, buddy.
All right.
Goodbye.
Everyone,
Thank
take care.
you.
Thank you so much. Great, Yasi. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your
Thank you.
questions.
Absolutely. Now, beautiful
Thank you.
reading. Also, thank you. Emma. Hello, Emma. Hello.
Hey, Tom.
Hey,
you,
Alma.
Robert.
Hey, Nick.
Guys.
Thank you.
Hey, Robert.
Hey, Robert. Good to see you. Hey, Tyler.
Great to see you.
Hey, you guys. This is fantastic. We deserve our lunch right now.
Lunch in New York City.
Congratulations on the show too, Sanford. Ciao.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
congrats.
Ciao.
Great show. Great show.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Yasi.
Great.
Thank
you.
you.